France, World War II. This combination doesn't exactly evoke thoughts of glory and victory. As a matter of fact, you probably just imagined some meme about France surrendering, and yes, France's swift defeat at the hands of Germany may be something of a joke. But what if I told you France was probably a lot more capable than you would give it credit for? This was the nation which, just a few decades earlier, had held Germany off for years during the First Great War, and by 1939 was a notable industrial power, held Europe's second largest navy, not to mention Europe's largest army, and possessed far more tanks than Germany, which were arguably superior in construction, though were made little use of. France's army during this period is often, though wrongfully considered, woefully undertrained, many simply assuming that a large quantity of French soldiers were undisciplined recruits from the colonies, but at the height of its numbers the French army numbered some 8 million men, with only 300,000 of those men being colonial recruits, that being less than 5% of the total manpower, with the majority of France's soldiers having already served in the previous war or readily trained since then. Thus, the quality of France's soldiers wasn't a field in which it was lacking. However, quality of leadership certainly may have been. France's leadership, from the president to its generals, were helmed by a timid and meek lot who hesitated in making a push for war, and would not accept the recommendations of newer, younger officers like Charles de Gaulle, instead holding true to the tactics of World War I, something Germany had since moved far beyond, and had already learned from. It'd be those same leaders who resorted to fleeing, surrendering, and negotiating when their tactics proved faulty. A lack of leadership and inspiration, paired with France's soldiers already being weary of war, left a good lot of trained men who simply didn't want a repetition of the last war, which itself had its own side effect of dividing the French people deeply, notably along nationalist and socialist alternatives headed by the French Popular Party and French Popular Front respectively. Yeah, those names can get a little confusing. So to sum it all up, by World War II, France did have the capability to combat Germany. They had far more men, their soldiers were certainly well trained, they had far more tanks, and a far more capable navy, although navy combat with Germany probably wouldn't be all too necessary. However, this was weighted down by poor leadership and disunity within France. But what if things had gone differently for the French? What if they had managed the leadership needed to direct their army against Germany, and in essence, win World War II? For this, we're simply going to propose that Charles de Gaulle, would-be leader and general of Free France, be appointed the Secretary General of the War Council, a position he was expected to receive following the inauguration of new Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, but instead went to campaign financer Paul Baudouin. Had de Gaulle become Secretary General, he would in essence become France's primary military advisor. Now, there's no assurance that this would be enough to correct the mistakes of the French military leadership at the time, but if he could guide them in the right direction, it may just be enough to reinforce the French defense and perhaps even lead the charge before Germany even had the chance to invade, bringing the conflict to a swift end and forcing Germany to release Poland, Norway, and Czechoslovakia from its grasp, neutralizing the threat of German expansion while annexing more Western German territory as punishment. However, despite this, the USSR would still retain its slice of Polish land gained from its invasion of Poland with Germany. And while in France a victory had been secured, political division still grew, and if not for the invasion of France in our timeline, it is very possible that we would have witnessed something akin to a French Civil War or a revolutionary regime change. De Gaulle knew this too, always holding in his mind an idea of France as a great independent power, but now saw it torn between two ideologies which could very well subvert and flood away the old Republican ideals of the French Revolution, a nationalism founded on sovereignty and national unity, or simply, French unity through French strength. In this timeline, the stressors of another war, despite France's victory, lead to a great schism between the right and left, which ultimately escalates into a new revolution. De Gaulle would align himself with the Nationalists, a coalition of numerous right-wing ideologies, against the Communists and their coalition of left-wing ideologies, during this year of instability within the French nation. All the while, Germany and the Soviets developed escalatingly dangerous relations, the Soviets now perceiving Germany as vulnerable, but not yet prepared themselves to launch an invasion against their ideological nemesis. Germany, fearing the growing strength of the Soviet Union, continues militarizing and training new soldiers under the guide of General Erwin Rommel for a defensive war against the USSR, waiting instead for the Soviets to invade what remained of Poland and come to them in order to avoid instigating another conflict with France or Britain. The Soviets, no longer fearing an invasion from Germany, at least not in the immediate future, direct more resources to supporting the Communists in northern China and Mongolia in an attempt to drive the Japanese from the region. Likewise, Japan would need to funnel greater resources into its western front, delaying its expansion in the attack on Pearl Harbor until the Communists could be at the very least momentarily neutralized. Late 1941, France is re-stabilized with de Gaulle assuming power under the Fourth French Republic, Needing to rid France of any subversive elements, he would launch a series of legal purges to arrest and outlaw any communist and radical far-left factions he perceived as a threat to the French national sovereignty, as well as any sympathizers to both the Soviet Union and Germany, launching a propaganda campaign against communism and, quote, German socialism. Mussolini would have reached out to de Gaulle in hopes of creating a Latin bloc precursor to his hopeful Neo-Roman Empire. De Gaulle would not be in favor of the greater Roman Empire ideal, but did favor the idea of European integration into a confederation of sovereign states. This would lead France and Italy to establish the European Trade Confederation, a free movement and trade zone between Belgium, France, and Italy, with invitations extended to Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. This, along with a movement toward a debt-free currency, would be promoted by de Gaulle to edge the nation out of inflation and increasing poverty. De Gaulle's ideal of a great French state was coming to fruition. However, his allegiance to fascist Italy and various right-wing factions within his nation would pave the way for a new form of radical French nationalism, inspired by German National Socialism, with a Gaullist angle. The rising ideology was not necessarily sympathetic to Germany, but did share some values with it, some of which Gaulle did not agree with, but many of which he did share ground on. And with the rising threat the communists posed as Japan recoiled from their attacks and it became clear Germany may soon see invasion, many radical French nationalists would begin assuming higher positions of authority even within de Gaulle's own cabinet. 1944 would see communist insurrections simultaneously arise out of Poland, Finland, and Romania, each serving as a smokescreen for the Soviets to advance troops forward into Central Europe. Germany would fortify its border with both a defensive armored division and an offensive aerial force prepared to clear the way for an invasion. Both sides would have been well prepared, but each of their tactics created a dual spearhead situation in which both sides continued advancing into separate regions of their borders. The Soviets used their vast land to create a mass battlefield that German troops would need to charge through, while Germany's concentration of troops within a small area of land made essential walls that the Soviets would need to blast their way through. For Germany, it was a matter of endurance, and for the Soviets, it was a matter of force, and neither seemed to be slowing. The Soviet front for the Japanese had become grueling enough to bring them to the negotiation table with nationalist China. A simple resolution would be proposed: coexistence and cooperation to crush their mutual enemy, convincing the nationalists that their ceasefire with the communists was a plot to weaken and overthrow them post-war. Japan would release southern lands from their occupation, with the exception of Taiwan and Henan, and the northern regions of Manchuria, which would remain an independent kingdom under the rule of the new Qing dynasty. The Soviet-German war would continue to escalate as Romania and Hungary fell, Yugoslavia seeing imminent invasion. Italy and France would be pushed to take action on the side of Germany to protect Western Europe from communism. Britain, by this point, has long washed its hands of Poland, believing that Germany has been put in its place, and refusing to involve itself on the behalf of another nation, especially after such a thing initiated the First World War and the previous war. So, Britain would not be so eager to sandwich itself between Germany and the Soviets yet again. Thus, it was up to France to save the day. Germany, as its troops pushed on further and further away from home, saw their advance clamped down upon and severed from supplies back home. Soon, German numbers began to wane, while the Soviets pushed forward, sucking eastern Germany into its own border, leaving what remained of Germany to unite with France, falling back and creating a great no-man's land that the Soviets could not advance past, a great fortification of trenches, turrets, and barricades to halt the Red Army at all costs, for if Germany fell, France too would fall, and a fallen France was not an option. The borders would be held, and retreat was severely punished. In the east, Japan and China had driven the communists from Mongolia and northern China, threatening further advance and requiring Soviet action. Rebel groups along the northern coast of the Baltics would link up with Franco-German forces, where Soviet troops had begun to lose ground thanks to Finnish guerrilla fighters. It would appear as the months of war turned into years that the Soviets' hold on the west began to erode slowly but surely. It would be decided in 1949 to cease all conflicts, with the Baltics and northern portions of eastern Germany seeking liberation and unification into New Prussia, while the Soviets established puppet states along its western border in the form of the Polish People's Republic, Czechoslovakia out of the western Ukraine, Hungary, and Balkoslavia out of the eastern Balkans. Post-war, Manchukuo, Japan, and the Republic of China would create the Co-Prosperity Sphere Councilate, uniting Northeast Asia into, as Japan put it, a brotherly union. De Gaulle's France would be on the rise and on an increasingly nationalistic slant, especially as his term eventually ran its course and a new, further right politician took his place. Until that point, de Gaulle's relations with Britain would become increasingly tense, as despite his actions in the Euro-Soviet War having potentially saved the UK, British government would come to paint de Gaulle as the greatest danger to European peace, though the only thing he'd truly be threatening is Great Britain's hegemony over Europe. Germany, still under National Socialist rule, would come to develop a cooperative relationship with France for mutual protection against the Soviets, establishing with some British sympathizers the Union of Europe, and beginning a war game of sorts, a game of economies and arsenals, a new Cold War. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.